In our previous episode, we discussed the possibilities for bosses in the highly anticipated sequel to the best-selling Zelda game of all time, Breath of the Wild. So in today's video, we think it's only fitting that we take a look at the other enemies that stand in the way of Link's victory against Ganondorf. We have addressed some of the shortcomings and complaints about enemies in the past, but today we want to look closer at how enemies could be improved and expanded upon. So join us in this endeavor and make sure to leave a like, subscribe, as we take a look at the enemy designs inside Breath of the Wild 2. Before we get into the aspects that could be improved in the next installment, it's only fair if we first address some of the best things when it comes to Breath of the Wild's enemies. The most obvious of course being the AI. In previous installments, enemies generally only had two states of being, dormant or patrolling or simple attack mode, where they just carelessly approach Link without any thoughts for their own life. Breath of the Wild handles this differently. Rather than just mindlessly standing or strolling around, these creatures have actual schedules. They sleep, hunt, tell campfire stories, and have dance-offs. Besides that, they also strategize. They can attack in groups, flee from potential danger, throw rocks or other objects when you are out of reach, use your bombs against you, and even circumnavigate or counter your strategies. Some bigger enemies like moblins might even pick up smaller enemies like a bokoblin and throw it straight into your face. The magic of Breath of the Wild's enemy AI. All these things combined make some of the enemies feel less like simple video game obstacles and more like actual inhabitants of the world of Hyrule. It's clear that the Zelda team put a lot of focus on fleshing out the different enemy types, with organic enemies being more lively than ever, standing in very stark contrast to the Robotic Guardians, which are fearless and adhere to the seek and destroy programming. Well, that and spreading terror whenever you hear the Stalker's dreaded piano theme. The AI was definitely the biggest improvement in terms of enemy design for the Zelda series. Though the problems start to arise once you start approaching the mid-game. After visiting a significant portion of the map and conquering one or two divine beasts, you will start to notice that the enemy types generally stay the same across the entire map. The only mix-up being either a color variation or an elemental type. But at its core, they're still the same sets of enemies, but with different HP levels and weapons. It would have been a whole lot more enjoyable if each province had more unique foes that are only found in that specific region and adapted to its climate. This would create an anticipation when entering a new area, since you wouldn't know what you will be running into. In fact, if we were to take the entire list of regular enemies in Breath of the Wild and strike away any of the color elemental variations, enemies with only very slight alterations like the different Octoroks, cursed enemies or Guardian Scouts 1 through 4, as well as all the style versions which also act and behave the same way as the living counterparts, you will notice just how quickly the list diminishes. Truth to be told, with all these removed, we come to a total of a mere 18. On the 20 enemies in a Zelda game? And even then we're generous, as there isn't even that much difference between a Decayed Guardian, Guardian Stalker and Guardian Turret, or even Guardian Sentry and Guardian Skywatcher. Compare this to the very first Zelda game for the NES, which if we use the same method of removing variations of the same enemy and exclude traps, bosses and even sub-bosses, still come down to a total of 26 unique enemy types. Yep. Breath of the Wild just got outclassed by a game from 1986. 18 regular enemy types. For a game as large and expansive as Breath of the Wild is quite underwhelming to say the least. And we can only guess that the reason behind this were time restrictions and for the most part, programming the sophisticated enemy AI, as Nintendo has historically always been able to introduce many different monster types, both old and new into the series. Naturally, some of the most iconic enemies are missing in Breath of the Wild, but then again, some of these were more tied to dungeons. Which brings us to the subject of dungeon enemies. And these are as relevant as they were in our video about the bosses, since here's the list of all the enemies found in the Divine Beasts. Now, I didn't expect an extensive variety of organic enemies in a machine like this, but even little to no guardians? This speaks for itself. The Malice eyeballs aren't even listed as enemies, but rather categorized as traps under the collective name of Malice. So that brings it down to 2. 4 if you're feeling generous, and consider each cursed skull enemy as a separate enemy type. Now, we do realize that the Divine Beasts were purposely designed to be a giant puzzle box rather than a combat challenge, similar to most of the shrines. It is however very likely that Nintendo will not repeat this concept a second time for the sequel, since this idea has now been fully exploited with the 4 Divine Beasts plus the final trial in the Champion's Ballad. If the Zelda team decides to change it up and return to the form with more traditional dungeons, mini-dungeons and the like, they will have a great opportunity to introduce many new, while also bringing back many existing enemies, which could make their comeback in Breath of the Wild 2. Monsters that are unique and relevant to the theme or location of a specific province, temple, cave, or other type of dungeon is something that has always been very enjoyable. Let's think back to Ocarina of Time, where even as late as the Spirit Temple, you are still being confronted by monsters you have previously never seen before during your adventure. Breath of the Wild was all about discovery and mystery, so in this case the sequel would do well to give the same treatment to enemy encounters, where each dungeon, each province, or even specific area can throw something completely new your way. So for the most of the rest of this video, let's go over some ideas and suggestions, both our own as well as some mind-blowing concept art made by Harry Darlington. Link to his art station is in the description below this video. Let's start with a highly requested one: scary spiritual enemy types. Most 3D Zelda games, even the innocent and cutesy Wind Waker, featured monsters that gave us the absolute creeps, usually found in places like graveyards and crypts. It is quite ironic that a world which has seen the amount of death and destruction as Breath of the Wild's Hyrule does not feature any spirits or ghosts like enemies of the undead. Imagine the impact it could have had on many of the ruins found across Hyrule, if some of them still had lingering poes or ghoul-like spirits attached to them, and that fighting them would result in a lesson about what happened to their home and village. It would add even more weight to the tragedy of 100 years ago, when confronted with the undead who, much like the King of Hyrule and the champions, lingered in Hyrule after their demise. Eiji Aonuma made it clear during an interview with Nintendo UK that he do not really enjoy Redeads. Actually, he hates them. However, it is likely that at the same time he also realizes that a lot of people like their inclusion in the series, since no matter how much some of us hate screamers, we still find them entertaining in a video game setting, hence why Zelda's Redeads are so iconic. If anything, we already have a pretty good idea what a Redead would look like in Breath of the Wild 2, judging by the way Ganondorf is depicted in the E3 2019 trailer and the many ancient Sheikah monks in Breath of the Wild, which by the way were based on real life examples. More on it in the video in the top card. Then we of course have many other types of enemies of darkness like Skulltulas, Wall and Floor Masters, Gibdos, the list goes on. Most of these would make a welcome return and greatly supplement the already existing skeletal enemies. It would also be great to see some more powerful knight-like foes like Darknut, Stalfos, and Iron Knuckles make a return. Lucky for us, Harry has even made a concept in Breath of the Wild's art style to illustrate some of them. Or of course a brand new humanoid enemy that can challenge Link to a sword-on-sword or axe duel. These battles can be high-paced with a lot of agility involved. These types of enemies would be mostly found inside of dungeons. Speaking of highly unlike opponents, Dark Link. Yes, we know that he probably works better as a mini-boss, but since we forgot to mention him in the bosses episode, here you have it. And then of course we have other traditional enemies that could shine in Breath of the Wild's engine. As mentioned in our Eldin episode, the return of the Dongos to Death Mountain, arch enemy of the Gorons. Imagine if these after a fight could even be rideable to traverse the mountain range when we cannot use a horse in this area. That would be absolutely great. As for the rest of the overworld enemies, we have so many to choose from that were missing in Breath of the Wild. Deku Babas, Peahats, Tektites, and Kargaroks. We're still barely talking about a few of the enemies that could return from past games. And as stated earlier, it would be great if a lot of these enemies, as well as brand new ones, can only be found in certain areas of the map to keep the experience varied. The desert could have levers and sand snakes, tribes of first hostile Yeti-like monsters that reside in Hebra, a return of the classic Riversaurus in the waters of Hyrule, or even underwater if of course underwater traversal makes a return. The possibilities are endless. Now that the overworld of Hyrule is ready to be revisited, we can expect that the Zelda team has the time to fill the world with many more new and classic monsters to combat, including some of the enemies Harry Darlington made concepts of a few years ago. Even so, one aspect that has stirred quite a lot of speculation and debate is something we also mentioned briefly in our video about Breath of the Wild 2's bosses, and that is the return of Ganondorf and the impact his malice might have on already existing enemies and even wildlife. Since, is he able to corrupt them similar to how he corrupted the Guardians and Divine Beasts during the Great Calamity, turning previously normal and in some cases even friendly creatures into malice-infested monsters? Imagine fighting a malice-infested boar. Oh wait, that is just Dark Beast Ganon. But what about a mutated malice grizzly bear? Now that is some nightmare fuel right there. In many ways, this could be the revenge of the animals of Hyrule after we throughout Breath of the Wild hunted them or rode them against their will. The potential for many wildlife enemies in the sequel is definitely there, and with new wildlife that are hinted to be consumed by malice in the E3 2019 reveal trailer, we're certain that they will not remain as innocent as they were in the previous installment. Speaking of, wildlife is a massive topic, as turning them into enemies is only one of many things that could be altered when it comes to them in the sequel. As such, let's meet again next week, or if it's already up in the end card, to explore this subject further and much more in depth. So be sure to leave a like on this video, subscribe to the Commonwealth Realm, press that shiny notification bell, and again for all notifications to not miss that video. In the meanwhile, we want to hear what new enemies you want, and which enemies you expect to return in Breath of the Wild 2. Also, don't forget to check out Harry Darlington's ArtStation page to see some more of his great fan concept art for Breath of the Wild and its sequel. Not just regular enemies, but even bosses. Until then, why not enjoy one of these two awesome videos, or check out our patreon.com/commonrealm page to give that extra support. We will see you in the next one.